G'day friends, Riley here from Opal Auctions Shop 53 Frogs. I came across a huge parcel of Coober Pedy rough opal that's particularly good for opal carving. Those of you guys who have known me for a while know that I get the fizz from cutting calibrated cabochons. There's just something about the symmetry and the exacting nature of the cut that just gives me the fizz. But my first love was actually in opal carving. It's more accessible in that you don't have to have a lot of expensive tools to do it. And it also gives you a way to express your artistic side because there's a lot more choices that you have to make or that you get to make in choosing how you want to carve the opal and how you want to accentuate the contrast between the places that you want to leave rough and the places that you want to carve to be in a particular shape, or what you want to polish and what you don't want to polish. There's just a lot of options there that allow you to express yourself in ways that you just can't do when you're cutting cabochons. So I thought it would be an appropriate time for me to sit down and work through a carving for you guys to see how it's done and to see what the material that I'm posting actually looks like when it comes to a carving. I've picked this piece. I think it's really interesting in the way that it's shaped. It reminds me of like a, I don't know, sword shape or something, maybe like one of those pirate swords. You can see that it's a vertical, so whenever it formed like this in the ground, or like this probably, and the color layers are going across perpendicular to the way the opal formed, or pretty much perpendicular to it. So it makes it so that it's not a particularly good material for making cabochons unless you want to make kind of like long rectangular ones. It works much better as a pendant piece, right? So you know, it'll be like this, and I'll polish one side of it. I like leaving pieces like this in the back if it's appropriate and there's not a lot of sand. Rough, the contrast between like making something a part of it really highly polished and part of it rough gives it a nice feel. You know, I think so much of the stuff that you buy today is manufactured in the bazillions, and it just has no maker's hand in it. It has no feel of the ground in it. And carving is one of those things that allows you to put that back into your work. You know, whenever I was making jewelry, I always wanted to make it rougher than you would find in a mall or something like that. I want you to be able to see that a person's hands have sat there and, you know, and hammered the thing out. I always feel like that, you know, is more comforting, it's more natural to me, and something that I want to wear, and that's something that I put into my jewelry, and it's also something that I want to create in my opal carving. So with that being said, I'm going to get started now. Most of this stuff, like I said, is you know, easily obtainable by you guys if you want to, you know, if you want to try this yourselves. You really just need like a Sharpie, some diamond centered tips, some Nova points, and some felt and some cerium to polish it off. If you want to hang it on a pendant, you could also use like a little diamond coated hole drill bit like I carry in my shop, or there are other ways. I mean, you can wire wrap these kinds of things, but I particularly like putting a hole through them so that you can just hang them from a chain. All right, let's get started. I like to leave the back rough, but there's a little bit of a, you want it to sit properly, and there's a little bit of a hump here, so I'm going to try to take it down a bit. Now I'm going to start taking off all of the sharp edges of the stone and roughing out the shape that I want. One of the main jobs of these diamond centered bits is to take off anything that's a sharp edge so that you can polish with your Nova tips. The Nova tips are really sensitive to sharp edges, and so it's important that you get all of them off before you switch from the diamond centered bits over to the polishing Nova tips. Now we're about to use our Sharpie here. A big warning, do not get your Sharpie wet. If you get your Sharpie wet, it will stop working. Sharpies do not like the water. Alright, so you get a Sharpie. Make sure your opal is perfectly dry. You don't want any water on here at all. I'm going to paint some of this with a Sharpie because it's going to tell me where I need to grind. Now, I want to leave this back natural, so I need to make sure not to paint the Sharpie on the back. But on the front, especially if there are any problem areas, like you can see right in here, I've got some problem area in there. There's a little crease in there, maybe here. Looks like I haven't hit this area at all. Now you don't have to cover the whole thing in Sharpie. I did this time just to just to show you what it looks like, but usually you would only do this in any areas where you think are like problem areas. That's enough of the black 80 grit. Now we're going to go up to the green 120 grit. These diamond-centered bits like a fairly fast speed and quite a lot of water, just enough to keep the dust down. Before you go onto each level, I highly suggest that you dry it off and have a look at it. It's much easier to see imperfections when you dry it off. Dry it off and then blow on it. Okay, pretty good. A couple of issues down here, and you can see there's probably like a natural defect that runs through the stone here, comes up through here. I don't think there's anything I can do about that, so I'm just going to have to be careful with it. What you're really looking for here is a real consistent grit. Alright, you see here, this is the blue 180 bit. For this one, I'm going to start on with my Nova tip. Start it with a 60 grit. Need to make sure to work these nice and wet, always nice and wet. That's the once over with the 60. I'm going to go back up to the 140 Nova. 140. So this is after the 140 grit. Let's see if things are starting to smooth now. Next up is the 280. Same thing, over and over. All right, next up we go to the 600. This is how she looks after the 600 grit, and I expect things start getting shiny after this. This is 600 grit's kind of the last of the frosty grits. Whenever you move up to the next one, which is the 1200 grit, you're getting into your pre-polish stage. This is the 1200 grit. This is the first of the pre-polish stages. The tendency is for people to use these tips too fast and too dry, and if you do that, the tips will just wear away really quickly. These tips don't mind operating slowly. They just want a lot of water, and they hate heat, right? So if you go too fast and it builds up that heat, you'll start seeing the color of the tip on the opal, and you never want to see the color of the tip on the opal. That means the rubber material is being deposited on the opal. That means you're going too hot, too dry, too fast. You want it nice and wet and nice and slow. The pre-polish is done now, and we're going to start with this 3000 kind of in between. Could be considered a pre-polish, could be considered where the polish starts, but this is where things start to get really glassy. 3000 is nice pink color. So this is the end of the 3000 stage. You can see how things are starting to get really shiny now. And now we move on to the 8000 tip. I highly suggest keeping these tips in the bags that they came in, or developing a system to keep them separate. Once you use them for a while, it gets really hard to kind of tell which one's which, and if you keep them in the bag and are really conscious of putting them back whenever you use them, then you can keep them in the right order. All right, almost done now. We get up to the 14,000 grit. I'm going over the entire stone about 3 full times with each bit. The last of the Novas we finish off is with the 50,000. It's just light blue. Nice, good final polish here. All right, now that the 50,000 is done, you could easily stop there. I mean, that's about as good as it can get. I don't stop there, though. I always finish this kind of opal off with cerium oxide, a cerium oxide slurry with a little felt. I think it just gives it a little bit higher luster. It doesn't take very long, and I think it's worth the little extra that you do to make that happen. Now, it's really important to understand here that using cerium oxide is a chemical mechanical process. And in order to make the chemical process work, you need to get enough friction between the felt and the opal in order for the cerium oxide to do its job. That means it needs to be a little bit warm. So you start out with it wet like this, and you keep on going until it's just a little bit dry. You don't want to cook the opal, you don't want to burn the opal, but it is really important to get that really nice gloss, that you do run it until it's dry, and you can start to feel the opal and the felt catching on the opal. It feels like it gets sticky. Whenever you start to feel that, you know that you're at the right point where it's doing the magical thing there that makes it so so glossy and has such a nice finish. Just a note here, I do this with Coober Pedy or Lightning Ridge, meant to be anything that's all precious opal. If what you're working on is a matrix opal or in a boulder opal, you don't use this last cerium step because the cerium will get stuck, impregnated into the pores in this material is so smooth that you don't have that issue. All right, so now I think I'm gonna clean this off, and then I'm gonna maybe make a hole here so I can string this on a strap. Whenever you drill a hole in opal, you can use these drill bits like I have in the shop, but you always want to make sure to drill in from both sides. Don't just drill one side all the way through. Start here and then turn it around and then start there and meet in the middle. Just find a place that I think looks good. Draw my Sharpie on it. Really try to see how I can connect it. Half the time in my shop I spend looking for the thing I just had in my hand. Alright, so these drill bits, they like a lot of water, high speed. You'll see I started an angle here to create like a divot in the stone so that I can go in straight and the bit will sit in that divot without wandering around on the face of the stone. It's really important to have a starting point. It's like almost like drilling a little pilot hole in a way. I'll do it at an angle, turn it, do it at an angle, make a little X, and then I can go in straight without the bit wandering around the face of the opal. That's what I'm doing here. I've got a lot of people ask me about this process. I really struggle with it. I think that probably they just expect that it goes faster than it does. If you want to do this right, it's often a really slow process. You don't want to blow the opal out. You don't want to burn your bit out, and so it's just really slow. I timed it and it took 5 minutes to drill this hole. I'll just leave a little clip of it here so that you can see the speed. Hard to see my hole. I can see that I'm coming in just under it. Maybe like right If you're not used to this process, I highly suggest maybe doing this in the very beginning before you even do any of the shaping of the stone or the polishing of the stone. Once you get the general shape of the stone, if you drill the hole in there, any mishaps that you have whenever you're trying to drill the hole through can be easily covered up during the cutting and polishing stage. See, I just popped through the middle there, and because I started from both sides, I got a really nice clean hole. Right around the edge of this hole where we drilled, it's really quite rough, and I don't want it to crack at that point. So Just kind of go around it and widen the mouth of the hole. Making sure to be very careful not to touch the face of that opal. Delicate cleaning method here. Blast it. Alright, so that's pretty much it for the carving part. It's really that simple. You just need to make sure to go through all of the grits and make sure to do each grit really well before you progress on to the next grit. Some pro tips. You do this long enough, your hands will get tired, and so always put something down on the ground. I've got like a little plastic mat or like little rubber mats. Eventually you will drop your opal, and you want the opal not to hit concrete or hard floor because it will crack. You could get towels, so I've used, drop sheets like you use whenever you're painting. It's a really simple, really easy precaution just to put one down and to make sure that whenever your hands do get tired, if the worst happens and you do drop the thing, that you're not going to break it whenever it goes down. When you drill the holes, make sure to go in from both sides. That makes it so that you don't have a blowout in the opal. Nova points, run them slower than you think you should. Doesn't take a lot of speed. Let the diamonds do the work. Use a lot of water. If you see the color of the Nova tip bleeding off onto your opal, it usually means you're running it too fast. If you do that, you can see that you're wearing down the Nova tip, and that's not what you want to do with these tips. They have diamonds impregnated in them, and you can run them nice and slow for a long time. I can cut 50 or 60 opals with a set of Novas like this easily if you use them the way they were meant to be used. Diamond centered tips you can use fast, you can use dry. Use them wet because you don't want the opal dust to get in your lungs or in your nose or in your hair. The reason we use the water is to keep the dust down and to keep the debris out of the diamond tips so that you can keep them continuously cutting in the same way. As you go through each stage, if you use a Sharpie, you can see exactly where you need to cut, especially if there are problem areas, if you've got divots and stuff like that. If you have a Sharpie in there, you can get in there, keep rubbing it out with the diamond centered tip until all of the Sharpie is gone. When the Sharpie is gone, you know that you've hit the bottom of, whatever issue that you're trying to do. Now, if there's an issue with your opal, if the Sharpie runs into a crack, the capillary action will pull the ink from the Sharpie into the crack and making it almost impossible to get it out. Sometimes if you submerge the opal in high content isopropyl alcohol for a day or two, that alcohol will dilute that Sharpie in the stone. If you're making pendants like this, and they're not really super high dollar pendants, they're just fun carvings, a way for you to explore opal and be a bit artistic whenever you're doing your opal, whenever you're carving your opal. If there's a little crack in it or something like that, it's a lot more forgiving than if you're doing like calibrated cabochons, in which case cracks are not at all acceptable. If you can keep the rough on the back of the opal and polish the front of the opal, you're going to increase your play of color and how well that color shines through. So if you can keep the back rough, do keep the back rough. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and learned something about it. For those of you who want to get started cutting an opal and just don't have the money for the big equipment, this is a really cheap, easy way to get into opal, and it's really enjoyable to sit down with an opal for an afternoon and cut it in this way. It's not a traditional opal that comes out of the process, and that's kind of the appeal to me and to most people that don't like that cheap white, bland Coober Pedy Opal that you see in every mall jeweler shop. Most people have never even seen an opal like this. I've wore opals like this for years, and people would say, what is that? I've never even seen that before. Or people that are October birthday babies would say, October is my birthstone and I've never liked it, but I've never seen an opal like that before. It's those kind of conversations that get people into opal, and they get people thinking about opal in different ways. Opals are not just calibrated stones. Opals can be anything, as wild as your imagination. Just go, let it flip, let it free. Do you, do your thing.